What happens when your older brother is too overprotective? I was at my 6-month anniversary dinner with my boyfriend when the restaurant door burst open. Police! Nobody move! Everyone hit the floor as officers swarmed our table, yanking Nick from his chair and cuffing him. You're under arrest for possession of drugs. We found 2 kilograms of cocaine in your vehicle. Nick kept screaming he was framed, but they were already reading his rights. I pinched the bridge of my nose. This was the 3rd boyfriend arrested for drugs. Owen, my first love, got 5 years for trafficking the day after our 6-month anniversary dinner. Golgius got 3 years for distribution, arrested during our 6-month celebration trip. After Nick, I stayed single for 8 months, changed my entire social circle, deleted dating apps, even started therapy to work through whatever energy I was putting out there. When I met Victor at the volunteer center, I thought finally, here's someone clean. I did everything different this time. I even made sure my brother met him early and watched Victor help him with his wheelchair. 6 months to the day, police pulled Victor over leaving my apartment. Cocaine in the spare tire, same exact spot as the others. The man who dedicated his life to keeping kids off the streets, suddenly a drug dealer. For boyfriend number 5, I went nuclear on the good guy thing. Dr. James ran free clinics in low-income neighborhoods. Single dad to 2 daughters. Literal white picket fence around his house. I was so paranoid by this point that I'd check his car every morning, feel inside his pockets before he left. He thought it was cute that I was so handsy. 6 months in, during family dinner, DEA agents kicked down his door. His 8-year-old watched them find heroin in Daddy's medical bag. After that, I swore I would be celibate. Until one day when my ovulation phase was ovulating, and I decided to go to an anti-drug rally to meet someone new. I thought the universe was giving me a sign. This man literally spoke at schools about staying clean, showed kids pictures of his brother who died from an overdose, cried real tears on stage about the dangers of drugs. I even made him take dozens of surprise drug tests. He laughed but did it. I was in the parking lot bringing him lunch for our 6-month anniversary when I saw it. DRG dogs surrounding his entire building. They found dope in his locked desk drawer that only he had the key to. That's when I made the decision to stick to toys instead of men. I was 8 months into this commitment when I ran into Owen, my first ever boyfriend, at Whole Foods. 5 years of prison had carved lines into his 28-year-old face, turned his blonde hair gray at the temples. When he saw me, his whole body started shaking. I really did love you, he whispered, glancing around nervously. Then why? Your brother visited me the night before my arrest. Said if I didn't leave you, then he'd get rid of me himself. Owen covered his mouth like he realized he said something wrong, and he literally ran out of the store. But that was enough. I drove straight to my brother's apartment, using the key he'd given me for emergencies. He was in the kitchen, cutting vegetables from his wheelchair. Did you visit Owen before his arrest? I asked. The knife paused mid-chop. Owen's out already? Must have been good behavior, I guess. Did you threaten him? He finally turned his wheelchair to face me. I've threatened all of them. Every single one. My legs went weak. What? They were going to leave you anyway. Men always do. Dad did. His voice was too calm, like we were discussing grocery lists. I just gave them a choice. Leave now, or face consequences. So you framed them when they left? He rolled closer. I didn't have a choice. Do you know what I found in Mom's journal after she died? She ended herself after Dad left us. The room tilted. You said it was cancer. You said she was sick for months. You were 10. Was I supposed to tell you Mom chose to leave us too? That Dad leaving broke her so completely she'd rather die than stay with us? His eyes were wet now. I would rather have 100 men suffer than see you hurt over someone leaving you again. That's not fair. It's what's right. Do you remember what you did after your first boyfriend broke up with you? If I didn't find you in time after you swallowed the pills, you wouldn't even be here anymore. My knees gave out. Benji, you've ruined so many people's lives just because of a decision I made when I was 16. I've protected you perfectly. I laughed. You're right. You have, but you forgot about protecting yourself from me. The things I did next made sure my brother never threatened another boyfriend again. I walked out of Benji's apartment on legs that wouldn't stop shaking. The hallway felt too bright after what just happened in that kitchen. My hands fumbled with my car keys 3 times before I got the door open. I sat in the driver's seat for 20 minutes just staring at the steering wheel. My brain kept replaying his words about Mom killing herself and how he'd threatened every single boyfriend. I finally started the car and drove home going 10 under the speed limit because I couldn't focus. The second I got inside my apartment, I grabbed my phone and hit record on the voice memo app. My voice came out shaky as I repeated everything Benji had just told me word for word. I talked about him admitting to threatening Owen and all the others. I described how he said Mom killed herself after Dad left, and how he'd been lying about cancer for 18 years. I mentioned the part about him saying he'd rather see 100 men suffer than watch me get hurt. The recording went on for 12 minutes before I finally stopped. I saved it to my phone, then uploaded copies to 3 different cloud accounts just to be safe. That night, I lay in bed with my eyes wide open watching the ceiling fan spin. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Nick getting dragged out of that restaurant in handcuffs. I saw Victor's face when they found the drugs in his spare tire. I saw Dr. James's 8-year-old daughter watching her dad get arrested at their dinner table. They were all telling the truth when they said they were framed, and I didn't believe any of them. I got up at 3 a.m. and made coffee because sleep wasn't happening. First thing when the hardware store opened at 7 a.m., I drove there and bought new deadbolts for my apartment door. I also grabbed a small fireproof safe for important documents and one of those video doorbells that sends alerts to your phone. Benji still had a key to my place from when he helped me move in 2 years ago. I spent the morning installing everything myself using YouTube tutorials. My hands kept slipping on the screwdriver because they were still shaking from yesterday. Once the locks were changed, I went through my phone and changed every single password I had. Banking, email, social media, everything got a new complex password that I wrote down and locked in the new safe. Around noon, I finally worked up the nerve to text Owen about meeting up to discuss what he'd said at Whole Foods. My thumb hovered over the send button for 5 minutes before I pressed it. He texted back within 2 minutes saying yes and suggesting a coffee shop downtown for tomorrow afternoon. That same day, I called the crisis line for my therapist's office and explained I needed an emergency appointment. The receptionist could hear something in my voice because she found a slot at 6 p.m. that evening. I spent the afternoon going through my phone looking at old text conversations with each ex-boyfriend. The pattern jumped out immediately once I knew what to look for. Nick had texted me 3 days before his arrest about having lunch with my brother. Victor mentioned Benji dropping by his office the week before the drugs were found. Dr. James had posted on social media about meeting my brother for coffee right before everything went down. Every single one of them had contact with Benji right before their arrests. I grabbed a legal pad and started making lists of everything I needed to verify. Dates of arrests, dates of meetings with Benji, methods of drug planting, whether he had help, where he might have gotten the drugs from. My brain worked better with structure, and making lists felt like the only thing I could control right now. I wrote down every detail I could remember about each arrest and what Benji might have done. My phone rang 3 times that evening, and Benji's name flashed on the screen each time. I let it go to voicemail without answering. He left a message after the 3rd call, his voice cheerful and normal like nothing had happened yesterday. He reminded me about our usual Sunday dinner plans and asked if I wanted him to make his famous lasagna. Hearing his normal voice talking about normal things made my skin crawl. At 6 p.m., I sat in my therapist's office and told her everything that had happened in Benji's kitchen. She listened without interrupting as I explained about him framing my boyfriends and lying about Mom's death. I showed her the timeline I'd made connecting Benji's meetings with each boyfriend to their arrests. She helped me understand that none of this was my fault, but I had a responsibility to report what I knew. We spent the rest of the session making a safety plan in case Benji tried to confront me or escalate things. She gave me the number for a women's shelter just in case and helped me identify safe people I could stay with if needed. By the time I left her office, I had a clear plan for what to do next, even though my hands were still shaking. My therapist leaned forward right before I left and handed me a small piece of paper with 3 names written on it. She told me these were lawyers who handled complicated family situations, and that I should document everything before taking any action. The names were all local attorneys, and she'd underlined one twice. I folded the paper and put it in my pocket while she reminded me to keep copies of everything in multiple places. Walking to my car, I felt less alone but way more scared than when I'd arrived. Back at my apartment, I sat at my laptop and started typing an email to Benji. My fingers kept freezing over the keys as I tried to find the right words. I typed that I needed space to process what he'd told me. I wrote that he couldn't visit without my permission anymore. I told him he had 0 involvement in my relationships from now on. The cursor blinked at the end of the last sentence for 10 whole minutes while I tried to work up the nerve to hit send. Finally, I clicked it and immediately felt sick to my stomach. I spent the rest of that afternoon pulling together evidence from everywhere I could find it. I printed photos from each 6-month anniversary dinner that I'd posted on social media over the years. I searched online for arrest records and found articles about Victor and Dr. James that mentioned the exact dates. I made a timeline on poster board with colored markers showing when each boyfriend got arrested. The pattern was so obvious when you saw it all laid out like that. Every single arrest happened within days of our 6-month mark. My stomach churned looking at the board covered in mugshots and dates. I had to run to the bathroom twice just from the stress of seeing it all together. The next morning, my phone buzzed with Benji's response to my boundary email. He wrote 3 paragraphs about how Mom killed herself because Dad left us, and how he'd saved me from the same fate. He said everything he did came from love, and that I was being ungrateful for his protection. He brought up finding me after my suicide attempt, and how I'd be dead without him. I took screenshots of every word before he could delete anything. That night, I couldn't sleep and started having a full panic attack around 2 a.m. My chest felt tight, and I couldn't catch my breath thinking about testifying against my own brother. I used the breathing exercises my therapist taught me, counting to 4 on each inhale and exhale. I kept reminding myself that those men deserved justice, and their families deserved the truth. I repeated it over and over until my heart rate finally slowed down. The next day, I called Lauren Meadows, the private investigator my therapist had recommended. Her voice was calm and professional when she answered, which helped me explain the situation without crying. She agreed to meet me for a consultation about gathering evidence that would actually hold up in court. We set a time for the following afternoon at her office downtown. Lauren's office had certificates all over the walls and a big wooden desk that made everything feel official. She explained the difference between evidence that's just interesting versus evidence that would actually work in court. She told me we needed witness statements and documents before approaching any authorities. She suggested starting with people who might have seen Benji near the boyfriend's cars or homes. Her confidence made me believe this might actually work. I texted Owen that same day asking if he'd be willing to meet and talk more about what he'd mentioned at Whole Foods. He texted back within 5 minutes saying yes and suggested a coffee shop downtown for the next morning. Then he sent a voicemail confirming the time and adding that he'd been waiting years for someone to believe him. His voice sounded tired but determined in the message. I saved it to 3 different places just to be safe. That evening, I went through our old shared Google Calendar from when Benji and I used to coordinate family dinners and holidays. I realized with growing horror that I'd marked every single relationship milestone on there for planning purposes. Every anniversary dinner, every special date, every 6-month celebration was right there for him to see. He knew exactly when to act because I'd basically given him a schedule. The premeditation of it made me physically sick. I had to close my laptop and walk around the block 3 times just to calm down. My therapist sent a follow-up email 2 days later checking on me and reminding me about the safety plan we'd made. She emphasized that Benji might escalate when he felt cornered, and that I needed to take every precaution seriously. She reminded me about the women's shelter number and the safe people I'd identified who I could stay with if needed. I forwarded her email straight to Lauren so she'd have documentation of the safety concerns too. Lauren called me that afternoon to say she'd already started making calls and had found some interesting leads about the storage unit Owen had mentioned. She said Owen's building might have old footage and we should check as soon as possible. The next morning, I met Owen at a coffee shop downtown and watched him stir his drink with shaking hands. He looked around the place twice before starting to talk about that night 5 years ago. Benji had shown up at his apartment with another guy Owen didn't recognize. They told him to leave me or they'd make sure he went to prison for dealing. Owen said Benji had photos of my car and knew exactly where Owen parked at work. He mentioned something about having connections who could plant stuff anywhere. Owen tried to warn me at Whole Foods but got scared when he saw someone watching us from the parking lot. We both started crying right there in the coffee shop, and I reached across to hold his hand. Lauren called while I was still sitting with Owen and said we should check if his old building kept any security footage. Most places only keep recordings for 30 days, but some newer systems archive everything digitally now. She thought it was worth calling the management company to see what they had from 5 years ago. I spent the rest of that morning calling different innocence clinics until I found one that helped wrongly convicted people. Requested Reds is on Spotify now. Check out link in the description or comments. The intake coordinator listened to my basic story and scheduled an appointment for the following week. They said they needed more evidence, but Owen's case sounded interesting enough to review. 2 days later, a huge flower arrangement showed up at my workplace with a card that said, "You'll always be safe with me." My coworkers thought it was sweet and kept asking who my secret admirer was. I felt sick looking at those flowers, knowing Benji was reminding me he knew where I worked. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about Mom and went through my old boxes until I found a photocopy of one of her journal pages. She'd written about her terror of being abandoned and how Dad leaving had broken something inside her. The words were shaky, like her hand was trembling while she wrote them. I could see where Benji's fear came from, reading her desperate thoughts about not being able to go on alone. The next morning, I went to a notary office downtown and created an affidavit describing everything Benji had confessed. I wrote out every detail I could remember about his threats and admissions in the kitchen that day. The notary didn't ask any questions, but I saw concern in her eyes as she stamped the document. Having it all official and notarized made everything feel more real and serious. Lauren called that afternoon to say she'd found Dwayne Schaffer, the retired cop who handled 2 of the boyfriend arrests. He agreed to meet with her next week, though he sounded defensive and suspicious on the phone. She thought he might know something about the anonymous tips that led to the arrests. 3 days later, I went to grab my spare car key from its hiding spot under the kitchen drawer. The magnetic box was still there, but the key inside was gone, and I knew Benji must have taken it. I called a locksmith that same day and had my car completely rekeyed with new locks. Then I drove it to a friend's garage across town where Benji wouldn't think to look for it. The Innocence Clinic called back saying they needed more than just my testimony to reopen any cases. They suggested looking for patterns in the anonymous tips or finding physical evidence of planting. I promised to keep digging and send them anything new I found about the arrests. They said cases like this were hard, but not impossible if we could find the right evidence. I spent hours that week going through old emails and texts looking for any mentions of Benji near the boyfriends. Sure enough, each one had mentioned meeting my brother for lunch or coffee right before their arrest. The pattern was so obvious once I knew what to look for. I decided to confront my building manager about getting security footage from Benji's visit last week. She was reluctant at first and said she couldn't just give out recordings to tenants. When I mentioned it was for a police matter, her whole attitude changed. She took me to the back office and burned the footage from that week onto a DVD. I watched it in my car and saw Benji near my apartment door for almost an hour. He'd tried my doorknob multiple times and looked in my windows before finally leaving. The evidence was building up piece by piece, and I knew I had to be careful about my next moves. Lauren said we needed to be strategic about how we presented everything to make sure it would hold up. She was creating a timeline of all the arrests with the anonymous tip dates marked clearly. Every tip had come within 48 hours of a 6-month anniversary, which couldn't be coincidence. I started sleeping at different friends' houses each night because I didn't feel safe in my apartment anymore. Benji had left 3 more voicemails crying about Mom and asking why I was being so cruel to him. Each message got more desperate, and I saved them all as evidence of his mental state. The weight of everything was crushing, but I knew those innocent men deserved justice after what my brother did to them. Lauren called me 2 days later saying Dwayne agreed to meet her at a diner near his house. She went alone with a recorder in her purse and ordered coffee while waiting for him to show up. Dwayne walked in looking nervous, checking over his shoulder before sitting down across from her. He admitted right away that all 6 arrests came from the same anonymous caller who always knew exactly where the drugs would be. The caller used different voices each time, but Dwayne figured it was the same person because they always mentioned being a concerned citizen worried about their sister. He never questioned it because the drugs were always found exactly where the caller said they'd be, down to which pocket or compartment. Lauren got him to sign a statement about the pattern before he left in a hurry. I reached out to prosecutor Angelina Watts through a mutual friend who worked at the courthouse. She agreed to meet me off the record at a coffee shop downtown during her lunch break. I brought copies of everything I had so far, including Lauren's notes from meeting Dwayne. Angelina looked through it all while eating her sandwich, making notes on a legal pad. She explained that proving someone planted drugs was really hard without direct evidence or witnesses to the planting itself. The burden of proof was on us to show Benji actually put the drugs there, not just made the calls. She seemed interested, though, especially when I showed her the timeline matching the 6-month anniversaries. Before she left, she wrote down her personal email and said she'd think about what would be needed for formal charges. That night, she sent me a detailed email listing exactly what evidence would make a case. She needed documented threats, which I had from Benji's voicemails, pattern evidence, which the timeline showed, and witness testimony, which Owen could provide. She couldn't promise anything official, but she basically gave me a roadmap of what to gather. The next morning at work, I asked my coworker, who was good with computers, if she could help me save some stuff from social media. I told her it was for a legal matter, and she didn't ask questions. She came to my desk during lunch and pulled up Benji's Facebook on her laptop. We went through years of his posts and found ones from each arrest date where he talked about protecting family and keeping loved ones safe. One post from the day after Victor's arrest said family comes first no matter what sacrifices you have to make. My coworker took screenshots of everything and saved them to multiple flash drives. She kept digging while I went back to work and found something huge an hour later. Benji had been using fake accounts with VPNs to submit crime tips online through the police department's website. The usernames all had similar patterns like Protective Bro 22 and Family First 88, and the timestamps matched up perfectly with the arrests. We screenshotted everything before he could delete it and backed it up to 3 different cloud services. I spent that afternoon at the courthouse filing for a temporary restraining order against Benji. The clerk gave me the forms and I filled them out describing his pattern of threats and admitting to framing my boyfriends. I included copies of his voicemails and the evidence about the anonymous tips. The judge reviewed it for about 10 minutes before granting the order based on what she called a clear pattern of harassment. It was just a piece of paper, but having legal documentation made me feel safer. The order specifically mentioned pattern of harassment and credible threat of harm in the judge's notes. Seeing those words in official legal language validated everything I'd been feeling about Benji being dangerous. I wasn't crazy or overreacting like he always made me feel. Owen texted me that night saying he remembered something from when Benji threatened him 5 years ago. During their confrontation, Benji mentioned having a storage unit where he kept things that could make problems go away. Owen thought it was a threat about hiding a body, but now he wondered if that's where Benji kept evidence, or maybe even the drugs before planting them. I immediately called Lauren and told her about the storage unit. She said she'd start checking facilities near Benji's apartment to see if any units were rented around that time. 3 days later, she found it at a place called Secure Store, about 2 miles from Benji's building. A unit had been rented 5.5 years ago under the name Pia Brody, which didn't match any real person. The interesting part was that Peter Brody matched the initials of Protective Bro, which was in several of the fake usernames. Lauren couldn't get inside without a warrant, but just knowing it existed and connecting it to the fake accounts was huge. My second therapy appointment was that week, and we spent the whole hour preparing for confronting Benji safely. My therapist had me practice what I'd say while she played Benji using different manipulation tactics. She'd cry about Mom or bring up my suicide attempt, and I had to stay calm and keep redirecting to his crimes. We went through it over and over until I could handle whatever he might throw at me without losing focus. She helped me set up my phone to record secretly, and showed me how to position myself so the camera would catch everything. By the end of the session, I felt ready to face him, and get the evidence I needed to protect any future boyfriends from ending up like the others. 3 days after my last therapy session, I picked up my phone and typed out a text to Benji that said I'd met someone new at the coffee shop and wanted him to meet them this weekend. My finger shook over the send button for a second before I pressed it. His response came back in less than 30 seconds, asking who this person was, and where they worked, and how long I'd known them. I could feel the panic in his messages as he sent 5 more texts in a row demanding we meet today to talk about this. I suggested we could meet at the park near his apartment tomorrow afternoon on one of the benches by the pond. He agreed but kept sending messages all night asking for more details about this made-up boyfriend. The next morning, I charged my smartwatch and practiced turning on the recording app without looking at it. I drove to the park an hour early and walked around checking exits and making sure there were people around. Benji rolled up in his wheelchair exactly on time, his face tight with worry. He started calm enough, asking about this new guy's name and job, but within 5 minutes his voice got harder. He talked about how men always have secrets, and how he'd seen patterns before with guys who seemed nice at first. I kept my wrist steady as he leaned forward and said the word consequences 3 times in one sentence. His hands gripped his wheelchair arms so tight his knuckles went white as he explained how easy it was to find out things about people these days. He said he'd already looked into every boyfriend I'd had, and knew exactly what choices they'd made. The mask he usually wore around me completely dropped as he described what happens to people who hurt the ones he loves. I watched him work himself up more and more until he was practically spitting the words about protecting family no matter what it takes. Then his eyes caught the small red light on my smartwatch, and his whole body froze. His face went from angry to scared in half a second as he realized I'd been recording everything. He immediately started crying and reaching for my hands, saying he never meant any of it and was just worried about me. The tears looked real as he admitted he might have made some anonymous tips to police when he got bad feelings about my boyfriends. He swore over and over that he never planted anything, just reported suspicions like any concerned citizen would. He begged me to understand that losing Mom had broken something in him, and he couldn't lose me too. I pulled my hand away and told him I needed time to think, then left him crying on that bench. That night, I transferred the recording to my laptop and played it back 3 times, typing out every important word he'd said. The part where he said he'd done it before and would do it again if needed sent chills down my spine. I saved the transcript in 5 different places and emailed a copy to myself. The next morning at work, I asked my tech coworker if she could help me with something else related to the timestamps we'd found earlier. She pulled up our old shared Google Calendar from 5 years ago and started matching dates. Every single anonymous tip to police happened within 48 hours of a 6-month anniversary that was marked on the calendar. She color-coded them on a spreadsheet, and the pattern was so obvious it made my stomach hurt. We printed out 3 copies, and she kept one in her desk just in case. 2 days later, Lauren called saying she'd tracked down the custodian who worked in my building. He remembered seeing Benji near my car about 2 weeks ago, holding something in his hands, but walking away when he saw someone watching. The custodian was nervous about getting involved, but agreed to write down what he saw and sign it. Lauren met him at a coffee shop and got his statement notarized right there. She texted me a photo of the document and said this was exactly the kind of witness testimony that would help build a case. I forwarded everything to Angelina, who called me within an hour. She explained that getting a warrant for the storage unit would need probable cause, which meant putting together all our evidence in a formal packet. She couldn't officially help me prepare it, but she sent me examples of what prosecutors look for. She said we were close, but everything had to be done exactly right, or it could all fall apart. I spent the entire next day at my kitchen table organizing everything we'd gathered. I printed out the transcripts from Benji's recording and highlighted the key threats. I organized the calendar correlations with the anonymous tips in chronological order. I included Lauren's interviews with the retired cop and the custodian's witness statement. I made copies of Benji's social media posts that lined up with arrests. I put the restraining order on top along with my signed affidavit about his confession. The packet was almost an inch thick when I finished. I drove to Angelina's office that afternoon and handed it to her personally. She flipped through it right there, nodding at certain pages and making notes on a legal pad. She said she'd present it to the DA first thing tomorrow morning. Walking out of that building, I knew there was no going back from what I'd started. The next afternoon, Angelina called to say the DA was assigning an investigative team to the case. They'd need my full cooperation and would probably want to interview me multiple times. She said after months of work, the system was finally taking this seriously. She warned me that Benji would probably find out soon, and I should be prepared for his reaction. That warning came true within hours when my phone started buzzing with calls from Benji's number. I didn't answer, but he left 5 voicemails that got more desperate with each one. The first one was him crying about how Mom would be so disappointed in me for turning on family. The second brought up my suicide attempt when I was 16, and how he'd saved my life. The third was pure manipulation, talking about all the times he'd taken care of me when we were kids. The fourth was anger, calling me ungrateful and saying I didn't understand what real love meant. The fifth was just sobbing and begging me to call him back. I saved every single voicemail and forwarded them to Angelina as evidence of escalation. I blocked Benji's number on my phone that night and went straight to my neighbor's apartment with a box of copied evidence. She took it without asking questions and promised to take everything to police if anything happened to me. I was taking every safety measure I could think of now. 3 days later, Angelina called saying the DA got approval for the storage unit warrant. The team found exactly what we expected inside that metal box. Photos of all my boyfriends printed from social media were taped to the walls with red circles around their faces. Calendar pages showed every 6-month anniversary marked in black ink. Notebooks filled with their daily routines sat stacked on a plastic table. The detective taking pictures said it looked like something from a crime show. They bagged everything as evidence while I watched from the parking lot. That same afternoon, my phone rang from an unknown number, and when I answered, it was a police officer. Benji had cut his wrist when they showed up at his apartment with the arrest warrant. They needed me as his emergency contact to approve medical treatment. My hands shook, signing the forms at the hospital. The cuts weren't deep enough to kill him, but deep enough to need stitches. He looked small in that hospital bed with bandages on both arms. I called 911 myself to make sure the psychiatric team evaluated him properly. They moved him to the mental health unit that evening for a 72-hour hold. The next morning, I met with the social worker named Evie Trotter, who was handling his case. She took notes while Benji talked about protecting me and doing what Mom would have wanted. He told her about finding Mom's body, and how he promised her picture he'd never let me get hurt like that. Every word he said just added more evidence to the criminal case against him. Evie looked sad writing it all down, but she had to document everything for the court. 2 days later, I sat in a small room at the district attorney's office giving my formal statement. Angelina sat next to me while 2 investigators recorded everything. They asked about each boyfriend and each arrest, and I told them everything I knew. They showed me the evidence from the storage unit and asked me to identify the people in the photos. I signed page after page of statements knowing this would end any chance of fixing things with Benji. Angelina warned me the process would get harder once family court got involved. She said cases like this could take months or even years to resolve. The next week, they called Dwayne Schaffer to testify about the anonymous tips. He sat in that witness chair looking uncomfortable as the prosecutor asked him questions. He admitted every tip came from someone claiming to be a concerned sister worried about her brother's girlfriend. He never verified who was calling or questioned why the pattern kept repeating. He said the drugs were always exactly where the caller said they'd be, so he never had reason to doubt the tips. His testimony connected all the dots the prosecution needed. When Benji got released from psychiatric hold 5 days later, police were waiting to arrest him. They put him in handcuffs right there in the hospital lobby while other patients watched. I was in the parking lot when they brought him out, and seeing him in cuffs made my chest hurt. He looked at me through the police car window and mouthed something I couldn't understand. They arraigned him the next morning with charges of false reporting and obstruction of justice. The judge issued a permanent no-contact order, which meant we couldn't speak or write to each other. Mitchell Powers from the public defender's office took his case and immediately started working on a mental health defense. That weekend, I sat at my kitchen table writing letters to everyone Benji hurt. I wrote to Nick's parents explaining what really happened and giving them Sean O'Shea's contact information for appeals. I wrote to Victor's sister, who'd been raising his kids since his arrest. I wrote to Dr. James and his daughters apologizing for what my family did to theirs. Some wrote back saying they understood and appreciated knowing the truth. Victor's sister said she was just glad to finally have answers about why this happened to her brother. Nick's mom called crying and thanking me for coming forward, even though it meant turning in family. 3 weeks later, Owen met with the Innocence Clinic downtown about reopening his case. Sean O'Shea reviewed all the new evidence and agreed to take the case without charging anything. He said with Benji's confession and the pattern evidence, they had a strong chance of overturning the conviction. Owen texted me after the meeting saying he finally had hope again after 5 years of everyone thinking he was guilty. The clinic started the paperwork that same day to file for post-conviction relief. Meanwhile, Mitchell Powers reached out to Angelina about a possible plea deal for Benji. He proposed Benji plead to lesser charges in exchange for mandatory psychiatric treatment and supervised release instead of prison time. Angelina called asking for my input since I was listed as the victim in the case. I sat in my car for an hour trying to figure out what was right for everyone involved. 3 weeks later, I stood in the courtroom reading my victim impact statement to the judge, while Benji sat at the defense table in an orange jumpsuit. My hands shook holding the paper, but I kept my voice steady as I explained how Benji needed treatment more than prison, and asked for supervised probation instead of maximum punishment. The judge listened and nodded while taking notes, and Mitchell Powers squeezed Benji's shoulder when he started crying. 2 days after that, Mitchell called saying Benji agreed to plead no contest to obstruction charges with 5 years supervised probation and mandatory therapy sessions twice a week. The restraining orders would stay permanent, which meant we couldn't contact each other even after probation ended, but it felt like the right outcome for everyone. I spent the next month packing up my apartment and looking for a new place across town where I wouldn't run into memories on every corner. The movers came on a Tuesday morning and loaded everything into their truck while I walked through the empty rooms one last time before dropping my keys with the landlord. My new apartment had fresh white walls and windows facing a park instead of the alley behind Benji's building, and I changed my phone number that same day. I went through all our shared accounts, closing the joint savings we'd opened after Mom died, and deleting the family calendar we'd used to coordinate dinners and doctor appointments. Owen texted asking if we could meet for coffee, and I agreed, knowing we both needed closure after everything that happened. We sat at a corner table at the coffee shop near the courthouse, and he told me Sean O'Shea was confident about his appeal moving forward, and I was genuinely happy seeing hope in his eyes again. Neither of us mentioned getting back together because we both knew we'd grown into different people over these 5 years, but the conversation felt healing for both of us. A week later, Evie Trotter called saying Benji was starting treatment intake, and I could visit once if I wanted to set boundaries for the future. I drove to the facility with Mom's photo in my purse and sat across from Benji in the visiting room where he looked smaller somehow in his treatment center clothes. I slid Mom's photo across the table with a note I'd written about getting help to honor her memory properly, and he started crying but nodded like he understood what I meant. I told him this was goodbye, and that I hoped he'd find peace through treatment, but we couldn't be in each other's lives anymore, and he whispered okay through his tears. My therapist scheduled extra sessions that month to help me process everything, and during one appointment, I made a commitment to stay single for a full year to focus on healing and learning what healthy boundaries actually looked like. She helped me see patterns in how I'd rushed into relationships trying to fill the void mom and dad left, and how Benji had twisted that need into something dangerous. We worked on exercises to recognize red flags I'd ignored and ways to build self-worth that didn't depend on having a partner. Angelina emailed me updates every few weeks, and in her latest message, she said the DA was reviewing all 6 cases, with 3 already moving toward dismissal based on the new evidence. She warned the process would take months, maybe even a year, but my courage to come forward was making real change happen for innocent men. That night, I pulled out a cardboard box and wrote "The Past" on it with black marker, then started filling it with all the evidence copies and photos from that time. I stacked the affidavits and recordings and screenshots inside, along with newspaper clippings about the arrests, and even the restraining order paperwork. The box sat by my door ready for storage while I cooked dinner for one with my phone turned off and music playing softly in the background. My kitchen smelled like garlic and basil from the pasta sauce simmering on the stove, and for the first time in months, I felt actual peace settling into my bones. Tomorrow would be a new day with new possibilities, and I was finally ready to face it without the weight of secrets and lies dragging me down. That's the full breakdown. Hopefully you found at least one piece that you can use in real life, because that's always the point of these. Stories are nice, but it's the takeaways that matter. Subscribe if you'd like to keep learning through them.